The text chimed softly on my phone as I sat in the dimly lit hospital break room, the glow of the screen casting a faint light on my tired face. It was late, and the night shift had been particularly grueling. I was about to ignore the notification when a photo popped up. A photo of my stepbrother, Ethan, standing proudly in a tailored tuxedo, his arm around his new bride, Sophia. The backdrop was a lavish wedding venue, dripping with opulence. My heart sank as I recognized the details. The chandeliers, the floral arrangements, the designer suits. It all looked eerily familiar. Then it hit me. This was the wedding my father and I had dreamed of planning for me years ago, back when my mother was still alive. The same wedding we had sketched out in a notebook, laughing over cake designs and guest lists. But now it was Ethan's wedding, funded by money that wasn't his to spend. The caption beneath the photo read, "A dream come true, thanks to your father's generosity. Everything Ethan deserves." It was signed by my stepmother, Clara. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't let the anger show, not here, not now. My name is Daniel Carter, and at 32, I've just discovered that my stepmother had stolen my mother's life savings. Money that was supposed to be protected by an ironclad will. But Clara had made one critical mistake. She underestimated my mother's foresight. I remember the day my mom called me into her study. It was just 3 months before the cancer took her. She was frail, her body weakened by the disease, but her mind was as sharp as ever. "Daniel," she said, patting the seat beside her desk, "we need to talk about what happens after I'm gone." I protested, as any son would. "Mom, please don't talk like that. You're going to beat this." She shook her head, her voice firm but gentle. "No arguments, Daniel. I need you to understand something important about the will, about your father." Her words echoed in my mind as I stared at the photo of Ethan's wedding. Clara had been gloating, sending me these pictures as if to rub salt in the wound. But I felt an odd sense of calm, because my mother had seen this coming. She had prepared for it. My phone buzzed again. Another photo. This time, it was a close-up of the wedding cake. A towering masterpiece that probably cost more than my entire month's salary. The caption read, "Sophia's dream cake. Your mother's money well spent." I clenched my jaw, but I didn't react. Not yet. Instead, I finished my rounds, checking on my patients with the same care and attention I always did. The only sign that my world had just been shattered was the slight tightening around my eyes. When my shift ended, I didn't go home. I went straight to my car and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. It wasn't the family lawyer. Clara had made sure he was firmly in her pocket. No, I called Marcus Thorne, the attorney my mother had secretly hired during her final months. "Marcus," I said when he answered, "it's time." Clara used Mom's savings for Ethan's wedding. She finally did exactly what Mom predicted she would. There was a pause on the other end, then Marcus's steady voice replied, "I'll file the papers first thing tomorrow. Are you sure you want to do this? Once we start, there's no going back." Was I sure? I thought about the last decade since my mom died, about Clara's constant undermining, her not-so-subtle digs about my career choice, her systematic campaign to turn my father against me. She had convinced him that my decision to become a paramedic instead of joining his law firm was a betrayal of my mother's memory, rather than the fulfillment of her belief that helping others wasn't about prestige or profit. "I'm sure," I said firmly. Mom knew this day would come. That's why she prepared for it. The next morning, I met Marcus at a small diner near the hospital. The place was quiet, the early morning crowd already gone. Marcus was waiting in a corner booth, a thick folder on the table in front of him. He stood as I approached, his expression sympathetic but determined. "I pulled all the documentation," he said as I sat down. "Everything's in order, just as your mother arranged. Would you like to review it before we proceed?" I nodded, accepting the folder with steady hands. Inside was the evidence of my mother's true legacy. Not just the savings Clara had stolen, but the entire network of investments, properties, and educational endowments she'd built over decades of careful planning. "Clara accessed the savings account last month," Marcus said, pointing to a bank statement. She withdrew everything to pay for the wedding. She forged your father's signature on the transfer documents. Not that he would have stopped her if she'd asked. And that triggers the trust conditions. Marcus nodded. Any unauthorized access to the decoy account automatically activates the main trust. Your mother was very specific about this. She wanted to give Clara enough rope to hang herself, so to speak. I thought about Clara's smug messages. Her certainty that she had finally proven her son's superiority over me. What happens next? I asked. First, we file these papers with the probate court, Marcus explained, pulling out another document. This evidence shows that Clara not only accessed the account fraudulently but also violated the specific terms of your mother's will regarding the use of those funds. That triggers a review of all estate matters, including the existence of the primary trust. He paused, his expression softening. And your mother provided for that too. There's a letter for him explaining everything. She hoped that seeing Clara's true colors would finally open his eyes. I sat in silence for a moment, staring into my untouched coffee. Part of me wished there was another way, that we could resolve this without shattering what remained of my family. But Clara had made her choice, and in doing so, she had proven my mother right about everything. Do it, I said firmly. File the papers. It's time Clara learned that being just a paramedic doesn't mean being naive. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 days after Ethan's wedding. I was finishing another night shift when a familiar black sedan pulled into the hospital parking lot. My father stepped out, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him. Daniel, he called out, his voice carrying across the nearly empty lot. We need to talk. I knew this moment would come, but seeing him there, still in his suit from the office, his hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it in frustration, made my heart ache. I'm just getting off shift, I said evenly. There's a diner around the corner. He nodded, falling into step beside me. We walked in silence, the early morning air crisp and cool. It reminded me of the mornings my mom used to walk me to school, pointing out the changing seasons in the trees lining our street. The diner was just opening, the smell of fresh coffee and bacon filling the air. We found a quiet table in the corner, away from the handful of early customers. Marcus Thorne came to my office yesterday, my father said finally, staring into his untouched coffee. He showed me some documents about your mother's will, about what Clara did. I waited, letting the silence stretch between us. This was his moment to process, to face the truth he'd been avoiding for years. Did you know? He asked finally, looking up at me. About the trust? About your mother's real plans? Yes, I said softly. She told me before she died. She knew Clara would eventually try something like this. His face crumpled slightly. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me? I countered gently. Over Clara? Over her explanations about how I was just jealous. How I couldn't accept my new family. He flinched and I knew I'd hit home. How many times had Clara whispered those exact words in his ear, positioning herself as the reasonable one while painting me as the bitter, resentful son? The next few hours were a blur of explanations and revelations. I showed my father the full extent of my mother's estate. Not just the savings Clara had stolen, but the properties, investments, and educational trusts she'd established. The paramedic scholarship fund was just the beginning. There were research grants, mentorship programs, even a small medical technology startup she'd invested in during her final years. She built all this, my father said wonderingly, while running the paramedic training program, while raising you, while supporting my career? Mom understood something Clara never will, I replied. True strength isn't about tearing others down to lift yourself up. It's about building something lasting, something that helps others rise. As we talked, Clara's calls became more frantic. Text messages flooded both our phones. What is this legal nonsense? You ungrateful brat. How dare you? Finally, one message caught my attention. Ethan's in tears. Is this what you wanted? To ruin his perfect day? I showed the message to my father. This is exactly what Clara does, I said quietly. She uses Ethan as a shield, makes everything about protecting her son while destroying yours. His expression hardened. Not anymore, he said, pulling out his own phone. He typed quickly, then showed me his response. Clara, enough. I've seen the evidence. We'll discuss this with our lawyers present. Until then, do not contact Daniel again. The silence that followed was deafening. 6 months later, I stood in front of a room full of aspiring paramedics. The scholarship presentation ceremony was being held in the hospital's main conference room, renamed the Margaret Carter Memorial Hall in honor of my mother. In the front row, Ethan sat beside my father, both of them smiling. The past months had transformed them both. My father had thrown himself into rebuilding not just his relationship with me, but his connections with old colleagues and friends. Ethan had surprised everyone by enrolling in paramedic training himself, determined to understand the path he'd once dismissed. Clara's absence was a quiet relief. The legal proceedings had ended in a plea deal. No jail time, but full restitution of everything she'd taken, plus a permanent ban from any involvement in medical or charitable organizations. Last we heard, she'd moved to Florida, her carefully constructed facade of sophistication crumbling in the wake of her exposure. As I handed out the scholarships, I felt my mother's presence stronger than ever. She'd known that Clara would eventually overreach, that her hunger for control would be her undoing. But she'd also known that the aftermath would create space for new growth, new understanding, new kinds of healing. Ethan caught up with me before I left the hall. The night shift supervisor asked if I could shadow you sometime, he said hesitantly, to understand what paramedic work is really like. I smiled, remembering my mother's words about Ethan being more like me than either of us knew. Come by tomorrow, I said. I'll show you what real healing looks like. As I walked through the hospital halls, I touched the locket I wore, the one containing my mother's photo. Clara had thought stealing my mother's money for a wedding was her greatest triumph. Instead, it had become the key to unlocking something far more valuable. The truth about strength, about family, about what it means to build a legacy that truly lasts. The next day, Ethan arrived at the hospital early, looking nervous but determined. I handed him a spare set of scrubs and gave him a quick tour of the emergency department. He watched intently as I explained the protocols, the equipment, and the importance of staying calm under pressure. It's not just about saving lives, I told him. It's about being there for people in their darkest moments. It's about giving them hope when they feel like they have none. Ethan nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He had spent so much of his life chasing prestige and status that the idea of finding fulfillment in helping others was foreign to him. Still, he was trying, and that was something. Midway through the shift, we got a call about a multi-car accident on the highway. The scene was chaotic, sirens blaring, people screaming, and the acrid smell of burning rubber filling the air. Ethan hesitated at first, but when I handed him a first aid kit and told him to follow me, he didn't back down. We worked side by side, stabilizing patients and loading them into ambulances. At one point, Ethan froze when he saw a young girl trapped in the wreckage of a car. Her leg was pinned under the dashboard, and she was crying out in pain. I don't know what to do, he stammered, his face pale. You don't have to do it alone, I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. We're a team. Just follow my lead. Together, we managed to free the girl and get her to safety. As the ambulance pulled away, Ethan looked at me, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and disbelief. I've never felt like that before, he said quietly. Like I actually made a difference. That's what it's all about, I replied. Not the money, not the status. Just being there when someone needs you. Later that evening, as we sat in the hospital cafeteria, Ethan opened up about his life. He told me how Clara had always pushed him to be the best, to outshine everyone else, especially me. But no matter how much he achieved, it never felt like enough. I always felt like I was living someone else's life, he admitted. Like I was just playing a role in her grand plan. I nodded, understanding all too well. Clara's good at making people feel like they're not enough. But you don't have to live by her rules anymore. You get to decide who you want to be. Ethan looked down at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. I think I want to be like you. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change. Ethan threw himself into his paramedic training, surprising everyone with his dedication. My father, too, began to reconnect with old friends and colleagues, rebuilding the relationships Clara had worked so hard to destroy. But just as things seemed to be settling into a new normal, an unexpected twist threw everything into chaos. One evening, as I was finishing up at the hospital, I got a call from Marcus. His voice was tense, urgent. "Daniel, we have a problem. Clara's back in town, and she's not alone. She's brought a lawyer with her, someone high profile. They're contesting the will, claiming your mother wasn't of sound mind when she set up the trust." My heart sank. "On what grounds?" "They're saying your mother was too ill to make rational decisions," Marcus explained. "They're also claiming that the trust was set up to deliberately exclude Clara and Ethan, which they're calling unjust enrichment." I clenched my fists, trying to stay calm. "What do we do?" "We fight," Marcus said firmly. "But it's going to get ugly. Clara's not going down without a fight." The next day, Clara showed up at the hospital, flanked by her lawyer and a small entourage. She looked as polished as ever, but there was a coldness in her eyes that sent a chill down my spine. "Daniel," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "we need to talk." I crossed my arms, standing my ground. "If this is about the will, you can talk to my lawyer." Her smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "This doesn't have to be difficult. I'm willing to settle out of court. If you agree to drop the charges and give Ethan his fair share." I laughed bitterly. "Ethan's already getting his fair share. He's getting a chance to build a life he can be proud of, something you never gave him." Clara's mask slipped, revealing the anger beneath. "You think you're so clever, don't you? But you're just like your mother. Always playing the martyr, always acting like you're better than everyone else." I took a step closer, my voice low but steady. "My mother wasn't a martyr. She was a fighter, and she taught me how to fight too. So if you want a war, Clara, you've got one." The legal battle dragged on for months, but in the end, the truth prevailed. The court ruled in our favor, upholding my mother's will and exposing Clara's lies for what they were. She was ordered to repay every cent she had stolen, and her reputation was left in tatters. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the way my family began to heal. Ethan continued to thrive in his new career, and my father and I grew closer than we had been in years. Even Clara, in her own way, seemed to finally understand the damage she had caused. One evening, as I stood in the hospital's memorial hall, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. My mother's legacy wasn't just about the money or the scholarships. It was about the lives she had touched, the people she had inspired, and the lessons she had taught us about strength, family, and the power of forgiveness. Ethan joined me, his face glowing with pride. "I got my first solo call today," he said. "A little boy who fell off his bike. I helped him, Daniel. I really helped him." I smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's what it's all about, Ethan. That's what Mom wanted for us. To make a difference, no matter how small." As we stood there, surrounded by the echoes of my mother's legacy, I knew that her spirit would live on, not just in the scholarships or the hospital, but in the lives of everyone she had touched.